suppose the question that we wanted to address this morning is that one about Irish political institutions and whether indeed they are fit to govern in terms of what we need as a society and an economy. I'm drawing from some of this from work that I did in a 2011 book, Towards the Second Republic. But there's been obviously a host of political reforms since that was published in 2011. And the most recent diagnosis of them from Reedy and Buckley in 2017 gives actually a quite useful starting point in diagnosing the continued maybe failure of Irish political institutions. And they identify a number of core failings, one of them being the continued lack of diversity of Irish political landscape in terms of who are brought into political institutions, and we know ourselves in terms of the gender diversity, for example, but other issues in relation to the lack of class diversity, ethnicity diversity, and a general sense that there is a cartel of similar classed people in the main political and administrative institutions of the Irish state, leading into things like groupthink and you know, the kind of problems that we know about. That feeds into relatively weak administrative and financial leadership. Still a very centralised political institutional system, and still quite untransparent, despite some improvements, some clawing on those improvements, and an attempt now maybe to roll out better transparency again. For me, the central paradox, though, at the heart of the problem with the Irish political institutions and therefore culture is the relationship between what is, in fact, a highly, highly centralised political structure, both highly centralised in the amount of power that the Cabinet has vis-a-vis the Parliament, the most centralised in Europe in a lot of the political analysis, but also the most centralised in relation to the national versus the local. So you've got a very tight grip on power by national cabinet, if you like. And then on the other hand, and inconsistent with that, you have PRSTV, a very localised electoral system that gives rise to a particular type of political culture at a local level that opens itself up to a more populist and clientelistic sort of relationship between the electorate and the people who represent that electorate. And that leads you into a fairly non-ideological space for the operation of politics at a local level. And if you combine that highly centralised state, highly localised electoral system with a one-party dominated state for most of the history of the Irish state, Fianna Fáil being that one party dominating the history of the Irish state until fairly recently, then what you get is a very unique take on a culture of politics. Peter Maher calls it a moral localism, a sense that you do what you need to do to deliver locally, and the big stuff looks after itself, the opposite of look after the pounds and the pennies. So what you get is very then short-term, pragmatic, non-ideological politics, strong veto powers being allowed, a lot of power in the vacuum that operates, and quite frozen policies of reform and paralysis when it comes to implementation. So a lot of frantic activity at one level and then a lot of inactivity at another level. And I think that the consequences of that type of political culture we've seen, and I mean it's been well documented, the kind of groupthink, the power of vested interests it gives rise to. And we've seen that in a lot of the analysis of the banking crisis, for example. But we see it now in relation to housing policy, for example, the frozen policy landscape, the lack of capacity to implement, the still serious rest that vested interests have on housing policy, the ability of groupthink, the power of an idea, for example, in this case, that the market will resolve the housing crisis, the power of that idea, and despite all the evidence showing it is simply not tenable as an idea, it's very, very difficult to get rid of that idea from the groupthink of those vested powers. But we've seen it in lots of other areas as well. We've seen, for example, the ability in the past of FÁS as an idea and an institution to stay in place despite a lot of evidence that it needed to move. We've seen, for example, in our tourist infrastructure, embedded institutions and vested interest staying long beyond what was nationally useful because of the nature of the grip of power that they have. We've seen as well that smaller ideological parties find it harder to thrive in that pragmatic localist political culture that doesn't thrive on ideas and policy debate. And I think myself, a particular problem that PRS TV throws up that maybe I think is maybe more problematic than is given attention to sometimes, and Catherine might like me say this, but it is the degree to which it can throw up independent candidates and the impact that has on ideological party formation, particularly smaller parties of the left. And I know you've got your own personal story to tread through an analysis like that, but I do think it does throw up challenges for smaller left or right parties for that matter, but ideological parties who are trying to develop and have to do it in a context where there is the motivation of candidates can be swayed somewhat by the more pragmatic choices that can be made sometimes around the local landscape and the role that independent candidates can play, and maybe the ease at which they can move into cabinet at the other level. So I do think that highly centralised and PRST combination does give rise to a real problem. PRS TV is often voted the best electoral system in the world. And in the political science analysis, there's very little reason to move from it. It throws up some good analysis in terms of what you want to do. But when it's combined with a highly centralised and already a political culture of post-colonialism that central clientelism played a hard role in, it gives rise to a political dynamic. So there has been a lot of focus on state capacity and institutional reforms over the crisis, some of it motivated by cost savings rather than the need to actually get the reform correct. And I think we're beginning to pay the price of that now. If you're looking at things like the debate that Mary Ellen Ring in relation to policing institutions is raising, and the capacity of GSOC, the capacity of the police ombudsman, the confusion between these ranges of institutions, there's a lot that we haven't got right there. I've had my own experience of working through the merger of the Equality Authority and the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, again driven by cuts rather than any really serious reform agenda, I think, and a real danger that the focus on socioeconomic equality could be lost in the context of a merge like that. So it's been really important to keep that on the agenda. So getting those types of political institutions that are about keeping the state accountable, getting those institutions right and working is very important. I mentioned that debate about electoral reform and the possibility of whether or not PRS TV is the right electoral institution for Ireland. To my mind, personally, I probably would go with reforming it towards the German or New Zealand system of a mixed list and district elections. But to be honest, I'm not sure that there is much appetite for that in the wider system. It's been looked at quite a bit over the last 2 decades. It's usually put to bed by any committees or conventions that are looking at it. So I do think probably the energy needs to be placed on the campaign for a permanent electoral commission, including the function of a referendum commission, and that's been looked at more recently by commissions and assemblies as well. And it is curious how little progress there is on such a blatantly obvious reform that's so clearly needed in the Irish context. There are questions too, though, about the crisis more generally of representative democracy that isn't just about Irish political institutions. We see globally that sense, as Peter Marr calls it, of ruling the void, of a hollowing out of the relationship maybe between voters and representative democracies that's thrown up real crisis for political parties and wider political institutions. And as he sees it, and this is happening globally, political parties, they do have less members. Their members are less inclined to be active. People are voting less. The voter turnout is quite consistently on a downward trend. There's some jumps up now and again, but the overall very longitudinal trend is down. The voting is more volatile. There's less loyalty to particular parties, which some people view as a crisis. I don't particularly myself. So there are issues about representative democracy and the capacity of representative democracy and political parties to play their role in what was traditionally seen as representative democracy. And I think we're seeing in response to that a number of really interesting experiments with other forms of democracy, be it participative democracy, be it new forms of online voting and plebiscitary democracy, or be it deliberative democracy, as we're seeing in constitutional conventions and citizens' assemblies, or even citizens' juries, which were actually popular about a decade ago, and we saw them in Ballymun and Ringsend on environmental issues. For my mind, I think these are useful, actually, and I think that they're proving their worth. But I think that they are, in addition to representative democracy, they should never be seen as potential forms of replacing the spaces in representative democracy. And I think we've seen as well, though, ways of bringing in new forms of deliberative and participative debate into parliamentary democracy, and that's been quite useful as well. Whether it's been on new ways of seeing how parties work together across issues in the experience of the Sláinte Care, you know, the recent processes that have been in the Parliament around the termination of pregnancy bill, for example, or even the recent Oireachtas Repeal Committee. I think we're showing through doing it how parliaments can work differently and be more deliberative and be more creative in how they process through key issues, and that's really important, and that they're welcome ways of strengthening all committees and parliament processes. And I think actually, in fairness, over the last 5-6 years, there have actually been quite a number of very small, tweaky kind of reforms in the parliamentary process, pre-legislative scrutiny, the role of agenda setting, the position of the Speaker of the Parliament, things like that, improvements to committee structures, the D'Hondt system to allocate chairs, better resourcing, changes in timetabling. They're all very small tweaks. They're not very newsworthy. They're not sexy. Nobody's going to really get voted in on the back of them. But I think bit by bit that they will come together to gradually begin to change a bit. One example that I was involved in myself is the idea of the Budget Scrutiny Committee, which again has been very slow to progress and we haven't actually seen it yet. But I do think that there have been changes to the budgetary process, that it is a bit more transparent, that there is more information, there's beginning to emerge some proofing tools. And I think together those types of things will make a difference to the quality of politics and decision making and the transparency that comes with it. Gender, of course, is one area where we have seen change and welcome change. I think given the importance of the local authority as a pipeline into national politics, that the gender quota is well worth examining in the context of extension into local authority government, remembering that it always should have a sunset clause. But I think that there's other issues. There's cabinet representation we've seen across the world, from France to Canada. The idea of 50-50 cabinets aren't mad, they happen. Women do get economic ministries a lot more in other countries, finance, Taoiseach, all of these need to be open for things. But I think in the era of Me Too, that sense of not all the reforms should be about institutional reforms. A lot of the reforms need to be about culture, and they need to be about politicians and people in the political system taking responsibility for their own class or ethnic or patriarchal dividend, and examine their own personal behaviours and their own take on power and changing their own culture in that regard. And I think we need to do a lot more challenging there. I think the ability of civil society to challenge the political system, though, is some area that we still need a lot of reform. And I think that goes back to some degree to our very weak system of local government, where if we had a stronger form of local government, it's usually the place where citizens interact most obviously with the state and where they experience participative democracy and their ability to interact with the state. And that's where we're very weak, I think. That's where the political class has usually interfaced on behalf of the system in a clientelistic sort of clinic-based local political culture. So the idea of active citizenship, Peter Maher calls Irish citizens passive citizens. Now, I'm not sure that's completely fair. I think things like the water movement and the repeal movement throw a question mark over quite how passive Irish citizens are assumed to be. But having said that, I do think that we have been relatively quiet about the degree to which the state is able to control civil society. And I think we've seen over the last maybe 2 decades a real attempt by the Irish state to control civil society. When civil society began to get maybe a stronger political analysis, when it began to move away from a self-help kind of community development, Winter na Tíre kind of backdrop to how communities organise themselves, to one that was more informed by political analysis, by community development, I think we did see a response from the state, a bit of a backlash, if you like, that started at the beginning of the 2000s. We saw, for example, the state first trying to maybe bring in civil society into institutions like social partnership, and that's been described in the academic literature as a smothering embrace of the state hugging in civil society to work with the state, for the state, and to not be a voice against the state. But I think when that began to lose its fruitfulness from both sides, perhaps, that the state moved to a more controlling form where Brian Harvey calls it I can never say this word, I shouldn't try it, the choke of the state on civil society, through things like service level agreements, which gradually over the last 10 years have begun to rule out things like advocacy. And even it's in the front of the Times today, not the Irish Times, the other one, Wayne Stanley brought my attention to this. But the degree to which service level agreements now for most community organisations who are delivering health or housing or drug services or anything, it's ruling out not only their capacity to campaign or to advocate, it's even ruling out their capacity to do action research or to allow researchers be on the premises of state-funded services. So this is quite a strong reach of a controlling state that percolates down then to the capacity of citizens to organise themselves through civil society to articulate their demands back onto the state. And that's quite worrying. We see other areas like that in relation to the standards of public office, for example, extending its reach far beyond probably what was the intention of the legislators at the time. And I think that's really, really important because that, if you don't have a vibrant, active, loud civil society able to stand up to and articulate their concerns to the state, then you don't get what you call communicative discourse. You don't get a discourse, a political discourse that is about change or transformation. You get a weaker, smaller, problem-solving discourse that's about just fixing things. You don't get one that's capable of actually taking people through a process of change. And just to illustrate what I mean by that is, I think we've seen communicative discourse in relation to the Repeal the Eighth. We've seen how when people get a chance to actually talk out in a very public, organised way with good institutional spaces, the reality of a problem and a big way to look at a problem, we've seen how communicative discourse can actually lead people to a more transformative way of thinking about change than a quick fix kind of mentality of how do we solve this problem in the short term. But if we don't have that wider capacity in civil society to respond to those challenges and have enabling organisations in civil society, good, strong community and voluntary sectors, for example, then we don't have that communicative culture in Irish politics, and we're all the poorer for it in our ability to take on the big transformative challenges, and we'll keep being a Jim will fix it political culture, which is exactly the problem we have right now in relation to things like housing and that. So I do think we need to learn from some of the things we're doing well. There's good lessons from some of the big transformative changes we've been able to do, for example, in relation to marriage equality or hopefully in relation to the space that's opening up in Repeal. But we need to be able to extend that into the socio, the economic and the environmental issues that are really the more structural, transformative challenges that we're not grappling with at all at the moment. So I'll leave us with that challenge. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Murphy. And I suppose just to speak with Catherine about this in kind of a more specific sense in terms of what the Social Democrats can take to this conversation.
Yeah, well, there was a lot of stimulation in that, Mary. You could have taken several different things and just interrogated each one on its own. I suppose we've got to look back to where we've come from as well. I mean, the post-colonial aspect of our country is something that is a feature of why things happened the way they did. It wasn't like a line in the sand, if you like, in 1922. And many of our institutions were ones that we inherited. And we inherited not only the structures, but the culture. And there was a culture of secrecy. There was a culture of dependency, if you like. And, for example, the local government system would have been very much about shiring the counties and controlling what was done. And I think that's still self-evident in the system we have at the moment, which I have heard it described as being radically reformed on about 4 different occasions over the last 30 years, but we actually have never actually reformed it, never mind radically reformed it, and it really does require that kind of radical reform. That would actually really shake things up if we were capable of doing that and involving people. They did something like that in Sweden, for example, where they looked at the local, what they called the third tier, and everything from the community organisations to everything from tidy towns to chambers of commerce, for example, were amalgamated to write the script for the future. We have great values at local level, but we don't actually bring them into our decision making. People care for each other. There's a really flexible can-do approach. Yet when you go to do things, you're told why you can't do it. And I think that there's a big piece of work to be done there. We tended to, the state tended to, mainly under the governance of Fianna Fáil, tended to outsource responsibility and confuse the role of the administrative and the political. And in actual fact, there isn't the kind of clarity that there needs to be there either. So, and there needs to be a responsibility on both. Those kind of things where there is a consequence are really quite important as well. But at an electoral level and at a citizen level, Mary, I think I remember the line from towards the Second Republic, and I can identify some of the changes you've identified that have been quite important in the Dáil and have happened as a consequence of not having a big majority, if you like, or even not a minority government. It has forced some change. But the level at citizen level, we really do have a problem with how we practice politics. The clientelist system, and you described the role of a representative as a middleman or middlewoman, and that's what it is. And when somebody comes into me to see me at my office, and they come in with a housing problem, or they come in with a social welfare problem, or Susie Grant or something like that, it's not a client that's sitting in front of me. And if you think of it as a client that sits in front of you, you fix that one problem. If you think of it as a citizen that sits in front of you, you try and fix the system. And you use the information they give you to understand how the system needs to be reformed, because our public services are so difficult to navigate that it makes it difficult for citizens to actually engage properly with the malfunctioning public services, and it frustrates people to the point that it forces them into becoming clients within a clientelist system. We have to put the citizen at the centre of the redesign of our public services, and you're totally right in relation to the reforms, or the so-called reforms for 2011 and 2016 particularly. It was a huge missed opportunity, and it wasn't that there weren't prescriptions. There was some great books put out towards the Second Republic. Totally recommend reading it. Give it a plug, Mary and Patrick Kirby. And in fact, I took some sections out of that and other ones at the time that were my go-back-to points. But the opportunity was missed because reform became code for cuts, and it became something to resist rather than something to engage with, where there were people within, for example, the public service that really did hunger for reform, who talked to you about the need for reform, who understand what was wrong about the institutions that they were members of. But once it became code for cuts, the curtain came down on that. It quickly became apparent that it wasn't about genuine reform, and that was a wasted opportunity. I know there was a lot of talk at the time that, don't waste a good recession. It was more than a recession, but don't wait. But that is precisely what we did in terms of the fundamental reform of our institutions. We also do things that are, we need to start, we've got this short-termist approach, and we need to look at, the penny will drop at some point. Over the last 2 decades, we've spent €500 million, 500 million euros on tribunals and inquiries. And we still have some of those on the go, and more will follow. Because the penny hasn't dropped, that the system is not working, and we need to put in the accountability where it is required. And we've proposed an anti-corruption agency. We didn't pick it off, out of the sky. We looked at what was working in other countries. There was a very good example that we partly took from New South Wales in Australia. And what prompted them to put in an anti-corruption agency were some of the features that we see in Irish society. It cost about, I think, $5 million to initiate, and in the first year it brought in 20 million. Now, you don't want to be bringing in money, because that's really kind of counterproductive. You wanted to change the culture within organisations and put in accountability where it's required. We also included in that anti-corruption agency, which would have the power to prosecute. We put in within that how you change cultures, how you actually bring better research and ideas, so that organisations will see it as something that is an asset and not just something to be feared. But it has to be big enough, and it has to have the skill sets. Far too much fragmentation in our approach. And it's, we'll give them a little bit here and there. This is the same point that Mary Ellen Ring was making about TSOC. You ask them to do a job in theory, but you don't give them the resources to do it in practice. If we don't do it in practice, well, let's say it doesn't exist, because it really doesn't exist. And what you do is you discredit something that has, the potential to be really good. So we have to start realising you have to pay for these. And you pay for them at one point, and you pay for it in 2 ways. If you pay for it in retrospect, because you pay for it by way of people being demoralised by institutions not working. So I think we've a whole agenda of work to do across a whole lot, whether it's citizen, whether it's civil society, whether it's the political institutions. But one of the things I think that we can be helpful with is that we've decided that the kind of political practice that this party should have at its core is from a bottom up, and it should be a campaigning approach. Not always against things, but for things as well. And bringing ideas, involving citizens when they want to be involved. It doesn't have to be you take a membership out and there's an obligation on you. But it can be where people have an interest in a particular area, and where you can tie people into. And I see Dermot Looney down there. I know the example of the budgeting at local authority level is a very good example of people being given a choice in how some of their money is spent. I think there are things like that. You can tie the formal with the informal in as well. So I think we need to be imaginative about the kind of campaigns. But campaigning is a real fruitful way of engaging people as well. And that's what we're going to be doing more of. So.
Great, thank you very much. So we've got just a few minutes. We might just take any questions or comments from the audience. We should have somebody with a microphone. So if anybody has questions or comments, fantastic. So 1, 2, 3, that's great. 4, fantastic. We'll take Louise first, please, Brian. Oh. There we go.
That better?
Yeah.
There we go. Louise O'Donnell, Cork North Central. So you were talking about there, Dr. Murphy, about the conflicting ideas of both local party politics and these ideas of local campaigns, but also the centralisation of government in general. What do you think are, I suppose this is a very ideologically based discussion in the first place. What do you think are some of the practical policy reforms that we could be instituting to prevent both this clash and to try and make a more equalised or balanced political system?
Great, thank you.
Are you going to take them all?
We might, because there might be a little bit of overlap. So we've got this person here in the front row as well, please. Thank you, Brian. Oh, 2 mics. Great.
Good morning. My name is Sinead Gibney. I'm a Dún Laoghaire member and former director of the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, where I worked with Mary.
I didn't see that.
What
did I say?
The live in here is really.
Yeah,
Yeah,
we
no,
can't
yeah.
see anybody.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, apologies, I've missed the first few minutes, so you may have covered it, but I'm curious to hear how you think things are progressing with the public sector duty and how that can be used as a tool to mobilise both civil society and the citizenry.
Cool. We had a person about 5 rows back there, I think, as well, and then yourself. Okay, great. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is David Girvin, also from Dún Laoghaire. Catherine, I suppose everything that has been said up on the podium today is extremely accurate, and we're identifying the blockages, the impediments to the society moving forward in a positive direction. My question is that, do you think something can be achieved without a particular political mass to be able to influence at the political level? And if so, do you believe any of the other parties would share any of our strategies?
Great. And then we've got the second row, and I think then we'll pop back to our panel here. Oh, one more? Okay.
Hello. Yeah, I'm
Just
Liz
right up to your
Walker
mouth,
from North Kildare, Celbridge actually. I've been, in relation to your talk and building a political system, what do you think about the unwillingness to change of the non-elected central government officials and the local government officials? They have, so sometimes you get the impression that their attitude is, well, we're here for the long run, and politicians just come and go, and we're the ones who really govern the country. And it's a bit frightening, because it's very anti-democratic. And that's my feeling about it, but I wonder what do you feel about it?
Great. We're just going to take one more, and then I'd say everybody's heads are full, so great. Yeah.
Thanks, Sinead. Dermot Looney, Dublin South West. Can I thank Mary and Catherine? It's been really enlightening this morning. So Philip is going to speak later from a Swedish perspective, and in Sweden they have a very strong local government. And Mary referenced it several times in her speech, as did Catherine. So my questions for you are, could you talk about your analysis of the local government reforms around 2013 and 2014, or the so-called reforms that happened then, and what you would like to see happen to local government and how that might feed into changing a political system that's, as the saying is up on the screen, fit to govern? Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Well, very little overlap there between questions.
Okay,
Great.
try and find some overlap. I think centering on Louise's question, but then I think some overlap with the issue of the power of the administrators, and maybe the question about the local government, to try and bring them into one answer. I suppose it's some of the reforms about the level of centralised power. I guess I was getting a little bit at some of them when I was talking about some of the reforms that can strengthen the role of Parliament vis-a-vis the Cabinet. And some of them are kind of subtle. You know what I mean? They are taking away, for example, the power of the Cabinet to set the agenda about what the Parliament can even talk about. Your very basic power. Some of them could be much more fundamental, though, in relation to, for example, the role of ministers, and whether or not ministers their function is being in the Cabinet or also being in the Parliament, things like that. I do think that there's a lot more of those types of, even if they're tweaky kind of reforms, there's a lot more that could be done to separate out the distinctive powers and roles of Cabinet and Parliament, and make the Parliament more powerful in relation to keeping the Cabinet to account, and that they would be necessary. So that's about pushing power down from the Cabinet into the Parliament. And then I suppose it's about pushing up the power of local government at the same time. Primarily, I think power is about money, and the biggest, most fundamental way that you can change the power of local government is in relation to its funding and its capacity to control its own funding and decisions therewith, and that there's a lot of changes that could be made around that would be useful. But more broadly then, I suppose some of the other ways are about making local government a more dynamic space where citizens are relating to it more broadly. And maybe that goes back to the question back there, is in relation to the Like some of the reforms that have happened have been about just moving pieces on a chessboard and no actual reforms at all. And I've been quite struck, and I don't want to be offensive about these at all, but say something like the public participation networks and things like that, where there is very, very little power, and we see an awful lot of movement and a lot of activity at local level, chasing after virtually nothing to some degree in terms of capacity to actually affect change. And you see it in relation to things like the role and function of strategic policy committees and things like that as well, where there are changes, but they're so, because the power of the administrator and the manager is still so powerful in the local government system, all of these changes on the end are actually about no power, really. They're about process and participation maybe, but they're not about access and control and decision making. And that kind of brings me on to your question, if you like, is really that whether it's about the power of the senior civil servant in relation to government departments or the power of the county manager in relation to local governments, is how do you hold that power more accountable? And I think you have to do that by statutory. I mean, you know, like it always strikes me as the amount of things that are going on at the moment where there is no reporting requirements. Like I was in the parliamentary committee on social protection on Thursday, looking at labour market activation, and we were making the point of, like, the only reason that we know how many citizens are being sanctioned with their social protection payment is politicians putting in freedom of information questions. There is no accountability on the senior managers who are making that policy and implementing that policy to feed back in relation to things like data on housing and things like that. You know, the level of accountability we require of senior officials is very weak, I think, and it could be strengthened at an overall level in relation to the reporting requirements that they have. And that brings me on to the public sector duty question, because I think the public sector duty that it's in the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission Act in 2014, but it's not something that the IREC do. It's something that it's a public sector duty on all government bodies, and that they must take into account equality and human rights in their development of policy and their execution of policy. And I think one of the immediate barriers there is that we simply find it very hard to track what are the equality issues in relation to both national services and local government services, because we don't have any data that disaggregates anything by the different equality grounds. The odd bit by disability, the odd bit by gender, but nothing comprehensive and nothing systematic. And I think one way of keeping governments and local governments, national, more accountable about the delivery of functions in relation to equality and human rights would be a legislative requirement to actually report what they do disaggregated across equality grounds. Because until we actually know and make visible some of these issues, it's very, very difficult to get a start in it. I've been really struck at some of the recent research we were doing in relation to both homeless families, but also in relation to labour market and more vulnerable populations, access and activation services, that when you do qualitative work on the ground, the level of feedback you get about the stigma that people experience in relation to public services is still so strong. So the amount of work that needs to be done in terms of increasing the quality of public services, particularly for people who are vulnerable and need those services on a day-to-day basis, we really, really need a lot. I mean, I'm not sure how much rollback happened over the crisis, but it does seem to me that there is a mood around, and the mood is a deserving, undeserving again, and you're lucky to be getting this, you know, quit while you're ahead, don't be asking for more. Like, there really is that people feel that the state can say anything to them sometimes, and they have to take it. And I do think there's a lot of work for public sector duty to do to lift up that.
Yeah, and of course there are people who don't have a problem being heard, but they tend to be very well connected, and that is where our clientelist system doesn't stop at citizen level, but it obviously blends into the relationships at political level and business level and things like that. And the bigger the entity and the more powerful, the more hearing, they get. And that's not something that people, are oblivious to. They see it. And they feel a sense of powerlessness about that being tackled. And that's why you've got to put checks and balance. That's why you have to have transparency, because without that you can't have accountability. And I think one of the things that I think would be something that we're trying to build support on across the political spectrum is things like the Anti-Corruption Agency, but also things like the point that Mary made in relation to climate. That needs to happen at every level. And for example, at the Public Accounts Committee, only 3 or 4 months ago, I asked the head guy in the economist in the Department of Finance. We actually have an economist now, and he told me that from 2021, they estimate we'll be paying 600 million a year in fines. Over 10 years, that's 6 billion. You know, we're saying you need to spend now to save on that, because you need to involve people in that change of culture. So I think the hard cash will maybe bring people around to understanding the consequences, but they need to understand the consequences in a much wider way and be involved in changing that system as well. I remember when I was given a temporary sabbatical by the people of North Kildare in 2007 because they wanted to put the people in that would keep the show on the road, and I ended up back in Kildare County Council, and there was cuts to services. And I remember at a public meeting, one of the most senior managers told the council that the first obligation that they had was to their staff. And I nearly lost it at that point and saying, no, your first obligation is to the citizens. And it showed me a mindset, and that goes into the point that Nuala made. It shows me a mindset of a very internally focused organisation that can't engage in the way it needs to engage with the citizens, because it actually doesn't see that as its first function. And so there is a cultural change in relation to that. And it's funny, people need examples. Like, I think Sláinte Care was a great example. Okay, let's write a proposal. Let's see if we can build a consensus. And I could say the minority government allows you to do that, Let's try and build a consensus. And then that consensus was built bit by bit, not by just 5 minutes, will you sign this or will you do that? It was a thoughtful process that took quite a bit of time, and Róisín invested quite a bit of time into it. Again, listening, marrying the expertise with people who are asked to come up with something that has a definitive outcome. And then it's the implementation of it. That's where the real challenge will come. And it's a question of building consensus around that. Those examples where you can actually demonstrate something can change if you actually do things differently, and if you take a longer term approach. I think that's how you build change. That can happen at a very local level as well. I mean, there was a playground needed in my area, and there was lots of very exercised mammies in the main, and you get 50 or 60 mammies who are looking at their kids, and I can tell you they're one powerful group if you can put them together. And that's precisely what they did. And they came down with their PowerPoints, and they told the officials that they didn't want to go this very circuitous route to be told there was no money for it. So they said, we want it in 6 months' time, and and they got it. And there's a great capacity built out of people taking control and saying, this is really what we want, and this is how we're going to collectively go after it. It is a need, and it's a need beyond children. It's about socialising your community in terms of people engaging with each other. Sometimes it's small things, but sometimes it's very big things. But that doesn't happen by people sitting in front of a television and shouting at it. It happens as a consequence of being able to engage in the correct way. And I think that is a real challenge. And it's examples that actually make that happen to a much greater extent. It gives people a feeling of powerfulness rather than powerlessness.
Great. Thank you very much. Oh, sorry.
Just say one more thing, because I just forgot to say, but you just reminded me at the end. Like, one innovative thing that has happened and that was shelved during the crisis but came back in has been the addition of the politics and society syllabus now into the Leaving Cert as a choice for students to take. And 140 schools are going to be rolling that out next year. And actually, it does get at that kind of sense of developing a more active citizen. It actually is at the heart of it. It teaches children to think in a different way as active, independent citizens, and it includes a lot of active learning and project work to activate projects at local level about change. So I would think that that's quite a hopeful kind of thing, and I think that role of education is quite important in that regard.